Today I'm going to talk about the Routledge Handbook of Greek Mythology by Robin Hard. And apologies if I'm mispronouncing Routledge. Is that right? Routledge? Anyways, this is a fascinating book if you are interested in the internal chronology of Greek mythology. And maybe, admittedly, that's a little bit of a niche taste, but if that's the kind of thing you're interested in, then this is the book for you. And it's the kind of thing I'm interested in. So I found this book absolutely fascinating. It was a long read. It's some 600 pages, big, thick book, heavy, but I'm glad I read it. It was really fascinating. So to perhaps explain the appeal of the book, maybe I should give some of my background with Greek mythology. And I've talked about this in a couple videos already, but just to recap, like a lot of people do, I got into Greek mythology around 6th grade and read a lot of Greek mythology through middle school, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. And when you first start to read those stories, they're absolutely fascinating, right? I mean, there are some great stories in Greek mythology. But you read one collection of you read one collection of stories on Greek mythology, and then you read another one, and then you read another one, and after a while you start to realize that it's pretty much the same stories. And then you think to yourself, well, I guess I know it all. There's nothing more to read. And with the exception of the Iliad and the Odyssey, I didn't really dive into the primary sources themselves when I was young. It was mostly just, retellings of Greek mythology. But after reading a few of those, I felt like I knew everything. Now, recently I've been trying to get back into Greek mythology and reading some of the classical plays that by Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides that I never read back when I was younger, and I've been talking about some of these on this channel, as well as rereading the Iliad and the Odyssey. And what's noticeable about all of those is that there are individual stories, but those individual stories always take place against the background of a larger chronology. So like in the Iliad, Homer's telling the story of the Trojan War, but he's constantly going back to reference the genealogies of these heroes and kind of tracing their lineage from the age of heroes down to the Trojan War. And in the various plays I've been reading by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, they're also constantly referencing the family trees of the characters in those plays, either to go back in the chronology to talk about their ancestors, or sometimes through prophecy to look forward to their descendants. And this emphasis on the genealogy and the chronology is something that I really didn't get when I was younger and I was just reading retellings of Greek myths. Because I think in most modern retellings of Greek myths, they present the stories as just kind of isolated. Whereas I think the Greeks themselves viewed all these stories as part of a family tree or a kind of a lineage rather than isolated incidents. So I've been spending a lot of time on Wikipedia over the years, looking up some of these family trees and trying to figure out how all this Greek mythology fits together. And, I think if you spent enough time on Wikipedia, the information is probably all there. But I much prefer to just read a book. And this is exactly the book I was looking for, because this lays it all out. So the author here, he's got a couple of family tree tables in the back here, which kind of trace the chronology that he outlines in the chapters. He says there's really two big families in Greek myth, and you can get almost all of the heroes from these two families. There's the Anakids, after Anakis, who was one of the river gods. And they had a few descendants, but then there's Zeus and Io. Now, if you've read any Greek mythology, you're probably familiar with the story of Io. She was one of the lovers of Zeus. Hera got jealous. Zeus changed her into a cow. She was tormented by the gadfly and guarded by the 100-eyed Argus, who Hermes slayed. It's a story maybe you've heard before. I certainly heard this before when I was reading Greek tales when I was younger. But what I never realized when I was younger is that this is the beginning of this huge family tree, which goes on to encompass so many characters from Greek mythology. In fact, this family tree spins out into several different family trees. So the Argive royal line gets continued in Table 5, the Theban royal line in Table 7, the Cretan royal line in Table 8. So we can flip over here. Here's the Argive royal line. Here's the Hercules. Here's the royal family at Thebes. So these are all descended from Io, or Io, the woman who Zeus turned into the cow. So yeah, I mean that's just one example of how these family trees work. And again, this ties into something I was reading recently, because when I was reading Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus earlier this year, in that play, Prometheus actually meets with Io, and or Io, or however it's pronounced, and they commiserate about their respective fates. Io is being tormented by this gadfly and driven across the earth. Prometheus is chained to the rock. But Prometheus does make several comments about Io's descendants. Sorry, I'm still not sure on the pronunciation. So, and at the time I was reading that play, I didn't fully understand it. But seeing this massive family tree that comes out from her, I understand that a lot better. Now, I mean, another great example here, and this is part of the same family tree. One of Io's descendants was Cadmus, who founded the royal family at Thebes, and these were all his descendants. And if you're like me, and if you've read collections of Greek mythology as a youth, you'll no doubt recognize several of these stories, but probably may not have realized how they all fit together into this family tree about the royal house of Thebes. For example, here's one of Cadmus's grandsons, Actaeon. Now, again, if you've read any collections of Greek mythology, you've probably heard his story before. His story is he was the hunter who was hunting in the woods, and he accidentally stumbled upon Artemis, who was naked and bathing in a pool. And as punishment, she turned him into a deer, and he was torn apart by his own hunting hounds. And that story is, as with a lot of these transformation stories, is typically presented just on its own in modern retellings of Greek mythology. Just like, here's another strange story about Artemis. And you read that and you think, oh, okay, well that's... I mean, it has its own kind of macabre fascination, right? A lot of these Greek mythology stories, kind of horror stories, they're fascinating when you're reading them when you're young. But you're kind of like, okay, that's a strange story, and then you just move on from there. But in the chronology of the cursed royal house of Thebes, you can see that this is one of the many disasters that was befalling the house of Cadmus, possibly because of a curse on the line, because he had killed a serpent that was sacred to the god Ares, or something like that. And in fact, a lot of, I mean, just sticking with the royal house of Thebes, a lot of stories that you may have heard individually or on their own actually all tie into this one family tree. So there's Cadmus. Now Cadmus ended up founding the Thebes because he was searching for Europa. So Europa, this is the story about the girl who got carried away by Zeus on the bull. You remember that story from Greek mythology? So Cadmus was one of her brothers who set out to find her. Cadmus is the one who killed the dragon and then sewed the dragon's teeth on the ground, and it turned into a race of soldiers. So Cadmus had a bunch of descendants, including one of his daughters by Zeus gave birth to the god Dionysus. And there's a story about how her sisters got jealous and they tricked her into forcing Zeus to promise to reveal his glory to her. And then she got burned up by that. And then one of Cadmus's other grandsons, Pentheus, is the one who denied the rights of Dionysus and ended up getting torn apart by his own mother during the Bacchae ceremony. And then a little bit further down the family tree, we have Oedipus, right? The famous Oedipus story. And Oedipus's two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, their civil war against each other was the famous Seven Against Thebes, which was one of the biggest events of the heroic age in Greek mythology. And then Cadmus's brother-in-law was Creon, who, of course, figures prominently in the play Antigone, when he and Antigone face off against each other. But Creon is also famous for being one of the hosts of Hercules during the early Hercules stories. So, I mean, you get the idea, right? There are a whole bunch of separate stories that are usually in modern retellings presented as just separate stories, which in the actual Greek mythology was all part of these family trees. And I think if you read any of the primary sources on Greek mythology, certainly the primary sources I've read, the Greeks themselves were very concerned about this family tree and kind of tracing out these genealogies. So just kind of seeing the chronology of this and seeing how it all fits together, I found just fascinating. So the Enochids is one family. The other family is the Deucalionids. Sorry, because I read this as a book instead of listening to it as an audio. I'm not quite sure on some of the pronunciation. You know how it goes. But this is another big family in Greek mythology from which all these different heroes are descended. Deucalionids 5, Deucalionids 6. And then we get into some other families here. But yeah, it's just fascinating the way this all fits together. And in a way I've long been curious about, but never before countered a book that laid it out so systematically. Now, this is the kind of book where as you're reading it, so, as you're reading this chapter, the early history of the Enochids, you are kind of constantly flipping back to the genealogical tables to try and keep straight who everyone is. And I was able to keep it straight enough while I was reading it. Now, how much of this is going to stick in my long-term memory? Who knows? If you were asked me to close this book and draw the family tree of the Enochids, I'm not quite sure how much of it I could remember off the top of my head. Some of it more than others, though. I do feel like the royal house of Thebes, because I'm quite familiar with those stories, I could probably draw most of that family tree. But anyways, the point is, I enjoyed reading it. I'm not sure I know this stuff by heart yet. I might benefit from some more rereadings of Greek mythology. This is a library book, so it will not be staying on my shelves, although it's the kind of book that might be nice to have on your shelves permanently as a reference. Someday I might look to tracking this book down for my own. But for now, I just read it, how much of this will stay in my long-term memory, we'll have to see. But let me jump all the way back to the beginning and try and make some general comments about this book. So it's based on H.G. Rose's Handbook of Greek Mythology, which I'm not familiar with. I'd never heard of before. I found this book, and I just happened to find this particular book on the shelves of my library. But I guess H.G. Rose was somebody who lived in the previous century and had done a very similar work where he had traced out the chronology of the family trees of the great families of Greek mythology. Robin Hard, as he mentions in his preface, had originally started this book up as an update to H.G. Rose's book, but ended up stopping that update halfway through. As he puts it, let me see if I can find the original quote. The outcome turned out to be thoroughly unsatisfactory. Too much of a dog's dinner to be at all palatable. I think maybe dog's dinner is an English idiom, like a British idiom. I'm not sure. But what he means is H.G. Rose apparently had a very distinctive style. And so that distinctive style, when it was meshed with Robin Hard's updates, apparently didn't flow as a coherent work. So he's instead written his own thing, which is based on H.G. Rose's book, but not an update of it. And he says that he hopes that Rose's book will still be available. I hope indeed that Rose's book may be kept in print for a while yet, and perhaps even attain its centenary. One of these days maybe I'll have to see if I can track down H.G. Rose's book. It might be interesting to read that and compare it. The first chapter, chapter 1, is the sources for Greek myths, in which he goes through alphabetically by author and lists the sources for the Greek myths. Now, this is the kind of thing that you would only read if you were interested in it, but I've decided I'm interested in it. One of the things that, as I've been trying to get back into Greek mythology, one of the things I've been curious about is what are the original sources, and how many of them would I have to read before I've read all of them? This, if you're curious about this like I am, then this is a nice little list. And again, I'm not sure how much of this is going to be in my long-term memory 5 years from now, but it was interesting as I read it. If I had to make a small criticism, though, I'm not sure putting it alphabetically is the best way to put it. It's obviously alphabetically because it's meant to be used as a reference, so when you can flip to it and find what you're looking for. But it's also part of a book. It's chapter 1 of a book. So I thought it would have made more sense to put these sources chronologically, because when you put them alphabetically, it leads to a number of awkward things where quite often the later source is in front of the earlier source. So the author will be referencing sources that will be coming later in this chapter, just because they were further down the way alphabetically, etc. And I think you want people to read this like a book, just write chapter 1 like a book instead of like an index. But I still found it readable despite that. Then we get into the story of the beginning of the gods. And again, if you're at all familiar with Greek mythology, you know this story well, right? First there was chaos, and then there was Gaia, and then there was Uranus, and Uranus was overthrown by the Titans, and then the Titans were overthrown by Zeus. So there is a narrative chronology to this, and it makes sense to retell it as a narrative. But then, after we get through the succession narrative, where the gods have overthrown the Titans and established themselves, then we just get into descriptions about the gods. And this, I read through this, it wasn't my favorite part of the book. So, for example, the brothers and sisters of Zeus, we've got Poseidon. Poseidon as the god of horses. Myths in which Poseidon competes with other deities for the possession of the Greek lands. Poseidon's consort Amphitrite and his children by her and the other mothers, etc. So we've lost the narrative chronology at this point. We're just detailing the attributes of Poseidon. And the author Robin Hard decides to put in a number of stories here. So, for example, when he's on this section detailing Poseidon, he puts in kind of all the stories in which Poseidon figures prominently here. And then later, when he gets to his chronology of Greek mythology, he just says, we've already talked about this story earlier, so I won't talk about it again. And I kind of thought, well, I would have liked it better if you would have put those stories in the historical chronology. I mean, that's why I'm attracted to a book like this, is because I want to see these stories in the chronology. But yeah, he makes a decision to detail the gods, and then after the chapter on the gods, there's the chapter on lesser deities and nature spirits, and he excerpts a lot of the stories out of the chronology to put them there. So for my money, the part where this book really comes into its own is on chapter 7, page 225, when we start actually getting into the history of it. So here we have the history of one of the prominent families in Greek mythology, the Anakids. And I was showing you the family tree at the back of the book earlier, but this is the text narrative here. So yeah, like I said earlier, it's just fascinating for me to see, as somebody who was familiar with these stories just as individual autonomous stories, to just see how they were all connected and see how they flow into each other. Now, if you know anything about Greek mythology, you know that there's like 3 different versions of every story, right? Because it was before the age of the modern printing press, and there were local stories and oral traditions and stuff like that. So there are variations on everything. But what impressed me as I was reading through this book is, in spite of a number of different variations on the details, the overall chronology seems to be pretty consistent. I mean, there are some exceptions where there are a couple stories have major variations, but for the most part, it seems to be a very elaborate, very detailed chronology, which, with all the little details that were changed and with all the little variants here and variants there, overall this chronology seems remarkably consistent across the Greek world. The author makes comments in passing about how mythographers in the ancient world, people who are writing about the myth in the ancient world, went through a lot of effort to straighten out some of these inconsistencies. So like there are 2 different versions of a story. Later authors would try and synthesize them or come up with explanations to explain these inconsistencies. I mean, it reminds me of kind of like fan culture, and I used to be a big Star Trek fan or comic book fan in my youth, so I'm familiar with how much effort fans will put in to explain away apparent continuity discrepancies in the franchises. It's funny to see that goes all the way back to the ancient world, where the ancient mythographers were already in the Greek world working to smooth out these things. It's a little bit unclear to me, reading through this, which came first. Meaning, I'm not clear if the elaborate family trees came first, and then the stories about the people in those family trees became elaborated over time, or if there were all these hero stories first, and then the family trees got worked out later. Robin Hard never tackles that question directly, but certainly the impression I get from a lot of the comments he makes is that it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, as these things got refined over time. What is fascinating to consider is how early this all came about. So, I think the earliest sources in Greek mythology were Homer and Hesiod, who emerged at the end of the Bronze Age collapse in the 8th century, when Greece was still kind of reeling from the collapse of the Bronze Age, and still had not recovered itself maybe as a coherent civilization. And yet, in the Iliad, even though the Iliad is about the Trojan War, it's very apparent that these chronologies are already worked out in the Iliad because Homer references them constantly. And Hesiod as well, who is a contemporary of Homer. So, it just makes you think how important storytelling and these elaborate continuities were in the ancient world. You know how important. I mean, I tend to think of kind of like this obsession with continuity and working out these elaborate stories is kind of something that modern, it comes with the modern 20th century nerd culture, comic books and science fiction and stuff like that. But it goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. It's fascinating to think about what that says about human nature. Well, I'm musing on what this says about human nature, though. The other thing that you cannot escape when you read this stuff is all the rapes. I mean, my God, there's like a rape on every page. And I knew there were rapes in Greek mythology. I mean, everyone does. But it's not until you sit down and you read this that you're like, wow. All right, enough with the rapes already. I mean, it's just, I don't know. Why? Was that just the way the ancient world was? Is this because men were writing these stories instead of women? Or is that, were the values different then? Or were women less safe in the ancient world? Or who knows? I'll just leave that question hanging. But you can't escape it. I knew rape was in mythology, but I just, until you actually sit down and you read through a chronicle of it, you just don't realize just, it's like every page. It's like every page someone gets raped. Anyways, I am just about out of time. This camera I'm using automatically, it has a limit on the video files of 30 minutes. So this happens to me a lot. I tend to ramble when I talk about books. I am not going to have a chance to talk about half of the fascinating stuff that was in here. But that's okay. I hope I've given a flavor of what was in this book and why it might be interesting for you to read too. It's a thick book. It took me a couple months to get through it. It's kind of heavy and bulky, and it's a little bit inconvenient for me to take with me on my lunch break, etc. But the prose itself is quite readable, even though some of these family trees get a little bit confusing. You have to kind of pause and go back and look at the family trees to help keep everything straight. I think this book is probably best suited for someone like me who already knows these stories, but doesn't quite know how they fit together. If you didn't even know the stories, it may be information overload. Learning all these stories for the first time and trying to keep track of the family trees. On the other hand, the author is trying to introduce each story as he comes to it. He doesn't assume the reader knows any of the stories. He retells all the stories as he gets to them. Yeah, I'm out of time here. So I am going to finish up here, and I will see you next time, BookTube.